Cora Halloran dropped her 2 carpet bags on the dirt of the Blackwood ranch yard and said the one thing a desperate woman was never supposed to say. It was not a plea, it was not a bargain, it was a statement of fact, delivered to the tall, weathered man who stood on the porch of the main house as if he had grown there, rooted in the worn planks like a bitter old pine. His shadow stretched long and thin in the late afternoon sun, a stark line drawn against the dust. With her son, Leo, a small, silent statue at her side, she looked at the man, at the tired slump of the barn behind him, at the whole exhausted spread of land, and she did not flinch. "Your cook quit 2 days ago in Casper," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the thin, dry air, clear and without a tremor. "The hands are eating jerky and hardtack. The one named Jed is threatening to leave if he has to look at another dried bean." The man, Silas Blackwood, did not move. His eyes, the gray of creekstones after a hard rain, narrowed. He had a face carved by sun and worry, each line a testament to a battle fought, if not always won. He had seen desperate people before. They came with stories, with tears, with hands held out for charity. This woman was different. She stood with her spine straight, her bonnet dusty but not askew, one hand resting on the shoulder of the boy who clung to her skirt. The boy was unnervingly still, his gaze fixed on a loose feather tumbling in the dust. "And how would you know that?" Silas's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder that might not break. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed, but also one thick with weariness. "I was on the same stage that dropped him off," Cora replied. "He was loud about his grievances. And your ranch has a reputation, hard work, fair pay, but a hard place to live." She tilted her head, a small, bird-like motion. "It looks the part." It was not a compliment. The porch rail sagged. A shutter hung by a single hinge. The corrals needed mending. The whole place seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the final push that would send it collapsing into dust. Silas felt a familiar spike of defensive anger, followed by the even more familiar tide of exhaustion. She was right. He knew she was right. He had been running on stubborn momentum for 2 years, ever since Martha died, and the momentum was failing. "We ain't hiring," he said, the words automatic, a wall he'd built around himself. "Especially not a woman with a child." Cora's hand tightened on Leo's shoulder, the only sign of her own desperation. She had walked the last 5 miles from the stage drop, the $2 in her pocket a useless weight. Her tea house in Laramie, the one she had built from nothing with her late husband, was a pile of ash, courtesy of a stray ember, and a town that had no fire brigade to speak of. The insurance had been a lie, the banker's sympathy a hollow performance. She had nothing left but her skills, and the small, silent boy who was the only part of her old life that remained. "You are not hiring because you cannot afford to be discerning," she countered, her voice still level. "You need a cook. You need someone to manage your household accounts, which I'll wager are a mess. You need someone to mend clothes, tend a garden, and bring a measure of order to this place before it falls apart completely." She took a step forward, her worn boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. "I am not asking for charity, Mr. Blackwood. I am offering a solution. I can do all of those things. I can do them better than anyone you could afford to hire, assuming you could find anyone willing to come out this far." Silas finally pushed himself off the porch post. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, but he moved with a kind of pained stiffness, as if his joints were packed with grit. He walked down the 3 steps, his boots thudding with a heavy finality. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the exhaustion etched around her eyes, but also the unyielding core of resolve within them. She smelled of dust and lavender, a strange and unsettling combination. "You're mighty confident for a woman with nothing but 2 bags and a story," he said, his gaze flicking to the silent boy and back. "Confidence is all I have left to spend," Cora said. "My story is my own. What I offer you is skill, tangible, practical skill." It was at that precise moment that the world seemed to splinter. A sharp crack, like a rifle shot, echoed from the direction of the far pasture. It was the sound of old dry wood giving way under pressure. A chorus of panicked bellows followed immediately. "Damn it all!" Silas swore, spinning around. A section of fence bordering the creek had collapsed, and a dozen young calves, spooked and foolish, were pouring through the gap, heading for the thick, dangerous scrub along the waterway. Two ranch hands, the lanky young one, Finn, and the stockier older one, Jed, came running from the barn, waving their arms and shouting, which only made the calves more frantic. They were scattering like quail. "Get the horses!" Silas roared, his weariness forgotten, replaced by the sharp-edged focus of a man fighting to hold on to what was his. But Cora was already moving. She did not run. She walked, purposefully, setting her bags down with a soft thud. "Leo, you stay right here," she said, her voice a low command. "Do not move." The boy nodded once, his eyes wide but his body still. She unwound the worn woolen shawl from her shoulders. It was a faded blue. She held it out, not like a weapon, but like a strange, soft extension of her own arms. She did not shout. She began to hum, a low, melodic tune that seemed utterly out of place in the chaos. It was a lullaby, the same one she used to sing to Leo before the fire. The sound was quiet, yet it cut through the panicked shouting of the men. She did not run at the calves. She moved sideways, a slow, deliberate flanking maneuver, using her body and the spread shawl to create a visual barrier. She wasn't trying to force them back. She was changing their minds, suggesting a different path. One of the lead calves, a brindle, shied from her, turning back toward the open pasture instead of the treacherous creek bed. The others, herd animals to their core, hesitated and then followed. Finn and Jed had stopped shouting, watching her with open-mouthed astonishment. Silas, halfway to the corral, stood frozen, watching this dusty woman and her faded shawl do what two experienced hands and a lot of noise could not. She was a point of calm in the swirling panic. With a few more steps and that steady, relentless humming, she had turned the entire group. They trotted back through the gap in the fence, confused but no longer terrified. Cora walked to the broken section of fence and waited, the shawl now draped over her arm. The men, shaking their heads, moved in with ropes and tools to effect a temporary repair. She walked back to her son and her bags, her face impassive. She picked them up and looked at Silas Blackwood, who was staring at her as if he'd just seen a ghost conjure a miracle. He cleared his throat. The sound was rough. 1 week, he said, the words tasting like defeat and something else he couldn't name. "You can cook for 1 week. The pay is $20 a month, plus board. The boy stays out of the way. At the end of the week, we'll see." Cora Halloran nodded once. It was not the gratitude of a beggar. It was the acceptance of a contract. "I'll need access to the pantry and the storeroom," she said, "and I'll need to know what supplies you have on hand." Silas just stared at her for a long moment. Then he gestured toward the house with a jerk of his chin. "The kitchen is through there. It's a mess." "I imagine it is," Cora said, and for the first time, the corner of her mouth twitched, the territory right next to a smile. "I'll see to it." She took Leo's hand and walked past the rancher, up the steps, and into the shadows of the house that was not yet, but had to become, her home. The kitchen was worse than a mess. It was a monument to neglect. A film of greasy dust coated every surface. A stack of dirty plates sat on the dry sink, attracting a slow crawl of ants. The air was thick with the stale, sour smell of old coffee grounds and rancid bacon fat. It was the smell of a place without a heart, a functional space that had long ago been abandoned by any sense of care. It was the kitchen of men who ate to live and found no joy in it. Cora set her bags in a corner and looked at her son. "Leo, can you do something for me?" The boy looked up, his expression serious. She pointed to a small wooden stool. "I need you to sit right there and be my watcher. Your job is to make sure no mice try to run away with our spoons." A flicker of understanding, perhaps even humor, crossed the boy's face. He nodded and climbed onto the stool, his small back straight, a silent sentinel in the gloom. For the next 3 hours, Cora worked with a methodical, unhurried fury. It was a process of reclamation. She started with the wood stove, clearing out the cold, compacted ash until the iron grates were clean. She found a tin of lye soap under the sink, a half-empty bag of salt, and a pile of rags that were stiff with grime. She filled the large kettle with water from the pump outside and set it to boil. The hiss of the water heating was the first clean sound the kitchen had heard in months. She did not scrub frantically. Her movements were economical, each one with a purpose. She scraped the hardened grease from the stovetop with a putty knife she found in a drawer. She soaked the rags in boiling water and lye, her hands protected by a second layer of worn cloth, moving with an expert's familiarity. She worked from the top down, wiping the cobwebs and dust from the rafters, washing the single grimy window, until a pale, watery light finally filtered through, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the air. The surfaces of the table and counters were scrubbed raw, the wood grain emerging from beneath its greasy shroud, smelling faintly of pine and lye. She was not just cleaning, she was performing an exorcism, driving out the spirits of apathy and despair. With every swipe of the rag, every bucket of dirty water tossed out the back door, she was claiming the space. This was her domain. This was where her competence would become undeniable. By the time the sun began to dip below the distant, jagged peaks, the kitchen was transformed. It was not beautiful, but it was clean. Deeply, fundamentally clean. And it had begun to smell of something other than neglect. She had found a small sack of onions, a few withered potatoes, and a slab of salt pork in the pantry. In a tin, she discovered flour, miraculously untouched by weevils. As the ranch hands trudged in from their work, they stopped in the doorway to the main room, drawn by a scent they hadn't encountered in a very long time. Baking bread. Not hardtack, not dry biscuits, but the warm, yeasty, life-affirming smell of proper bread. Dinner was not fancy. It was a thick stew of potatoes and salt pork, rich with the flavor of slowly sautéed onions. There were fresh biscuits, golden brown and fluffy, a world away from the leaden discs they were used to. And there was a pot of strong, hot coffee that didn't taste like boiled dirt. The men, Silas, Jed, Finn, and the quiet, older hand named Gus, ate in their customary silence. But it was a different silence. It was not the sullen quiet of dissatisfaction. It was the focused, appreciative silence of men enjoying their food. Jed, the resistor, ate 2 full plates without a word, his earlier complaints forgotten in the face of a decent meal. Finn, the young one, kept glancing at Cora with a look of pure reverence. Gus, the old sage, finished his meal, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and gave Cora a single slow nod. It was a gesture that carried more weight than a whole speech of praise. Silas Blackwood sat at the head of the table, eating slowly. From his position, he could see the whole scene. He saw the clean table, the steam rising from the plates, the quiet satisfaction on his men's faces. He looked at Cora, who was serving her son a small portion, her movements calm and efficient. She did not look like she was performing for his approval. She looked like a woman who was simply doing her job, and doing it well. He remembered the chaos at the fence line, her strange, quiet control over the situation. He looked at the kitchen, scrubbed clean and smelling of bread. It felt different. The house felt different. He was a man who had built his life on suspicion. He had been cheated by partners, betrayed by friends, and worn down by the relentless demands of the land. He had learned to trust nothing and no one that he could not measure or weigh. But as he took another bite of the stew, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the food, he felt a crack appear in the wall of his skepticism. He was still watching her. He was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. But for the first time in a long time, a part of him hoped it wouldn't. He looked at the capable outsider, and for a fleeting moment saw not a threat, but a possibility. The possibility of order, the possibility of a home that felt like more than just a shelter from the wind. In the days that followed, Cora's presence settled over the Blackwood ranch like a steady, soaking rain after a long drought. Her influence was quiet but profound. She rose before dawn, the first sign of her work, the gentle clatter of the stove being stoked, followed by the smell of coffee that now met the men as they stumbled out of the bunkhouse. The meals remained simple, but were consistently good, nourishing, and on time. The rhythm of the ranch, which had been stumbling and erratic, began to find a steadier beat. She was a keen observer. She noticed that Gus, the old hand, had a persistent cough and favored the bitter tea she brewed from yarrow and mint she found growing near the creek. Each afternoon, she would leave a steaming mug for him on the porch rail, and he would take it without a word, his gratitude expressed in the slight softening of his deeply lined face. She saw the way Finn, the youngest of the crew, looked at the worn copy of Ivanhoe she had in one of her bags. He was barely literate, his hands more comfortable with a rope than a page. One evening, she found him tracing the letters on the cover with a calloused finger. "My father used to read that to me," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Finn jumped, his face flushing red. "Sorry, ma'am, I was just looking. It's a good story," she said, "about knights and honor." She held the book out to him. "You can borrow it if you like." He looked down at his hands, embarrassed. "I ain't much of a reader." "Reading is just practice," Cora said gently. "Like braiding a rope, you do it over and over until it feels natural." She paused. "If you wanted, after dinner sometimes, I could help you with the hard words." Finn looked at her, his bright, honest eyes wide with a hope he hadn't known he possessed. "You'd do that?" "A mind needs nourishing as much as a body," she said. From that night on, for a half hour before he turned in, Finn would sit at the clean kitchen table, his brow furrowed in concentration, as Cora patiently guided him through the thickets of Sir Walter Scott's prose. He became her first and most devoted ally. But where there is change, there is always resistance, and the resistance on the Blackwood ranch had a name: Jed. He was a man who mistook tradition for wisdom, a man who felt his own position threatened by Cora's quiet competence. He had been the loudest complainer before she arrived, and now he became a silent, sullen critic. He disliked the new order. He disliked that the supplies were now inventoried, that he couldn't just grab a handful of coffee or a slab of bacon whenever he pleased. He saw it as an affront to his seniority. "We ain't running a damn hotel," he grumbled to Finn one afternoon, just loud enough for Cora to hear from the kitchen. "Got to ask permission just to get a cup of coffee. And all this reading. What's a ranch hand need with books?" Finn, loyal to his new teacher, bristled. "She's just trying to keep things right, Jed. And the food's never been better." "It's woman's work," Jed sneered, "making things fussy." The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. It happened on a Thursday, the 6th day of Cora's probationary week. Jed strode into the kitchen as Cora was kneading dough for the evening's bread. He went straight to the pantry, which she had organized into a model of efficiency, and reached for a new sack of flour. "We need this to dust the new calves for ticks," he announced, his tone daring her to object. Cora did not stop working the dough. Her hands, dusted with flour, pressed and folded, pressed and folded. "There is a half-used sack in the barn for that purpose," she said, her voice calm. "I inventoried it yesterday. That one is for the kitchen." Jed's face darkened. He grabbed the sack. "We've always just taken what we need. I ain't asking permission from no hired cook." Cora finally stopped kneading. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving 2 white prints on the dark fabric. She turned to face him. In her right hand, she still held the heavy, wooden rolling pin she had been about to use. She did not raise it. She did not threaten. She simply held it, its weight familiar and solid in her grasp. "This is not about permission, Jed," she said, her eyes level and direct. "It's about waste. This ranch is bleeding money. It bleeds from broken fences. It bleeds from sick cattle, and it bleeds from a pantry where no one knows what's coming or going. My job, the one Mr. Blackwood is paying me for, is to stop some of that bleeding. That sack of flour is accounted for in my ledger. The one in the barn is accounted for in yours. If you take this one, my books will be wrong, and I will not keep wrong books." Her logic was as solid and unyielding as a stone wall. She wasn't arguing about her authority. She was arguing about facts. It was a ground Jed was unprepared to fight on. He was used to bluster and intimidation, not calm, unassailable reason. He stammered, his grip on the sack faltering. It was at that moment that Silas Blackwood walked in. He had been on the porch, ostensibly checking a saddle strap, but he had heard the entire exchange. He stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the space, his expression unreadable. He looked at Jed, red-faced and belligerent. He looked at Cora, calm and resolute, the rolling pin held loosely at her side. He looked at the clean, orderly kitchen around them. He had seen this kind of challenge before. It was how a crew tested a new foreman, how the pecking order was established. He knew his response would define Cora's position on this ranch from this day forward. "Jed," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "Put the flour back." Ujed's head snapped toward him, his expression a mixture of shock and betrayal. "But Silas, the kitchen and the house are hers to manage." Silas cut him off, his gaze unwavering. "That includes the pantry. You need something, you go through her. That's the way it is now." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The only sound was the soft sigh of the wind outside. Jed's face went from red to a blotchy white. He held Silas's gaze for a long second, then his shoulders slumped in defeat. Without another word, he placed the sack of flour back on the shelf, turned, and stalked out of the kitchen, pushing past Silas as he went. Silas stood in the doorway for a moment longer. He looked at Cora. She had already turned back to her dough, her hands resuming their steady, rhythmic work. She did not offer thanks or look for praise. She simply continued her task. "He'll come around," Silas said, the words feeling inadequate. "Or he won't," Cora replied, not looking up. "Either way, the bread will be on the table at 6. Silas watched her for another moment, a complex emotion churning in his gut. It was respect. Pure, unadulterated respect. He had given her a measure of authority, and she had proven she knew how to wield it. Not with force, but with integrity. He turned and left, the screen door slapping shut behind him, leaving Cora Halloran in the quiet, undisputed command of her domain. The 1-week trial was, for all intents and purposes, over. She had already proven her worth. With her authority in the household solidified, Cora's work expanded. The provisional week bled into a second, and then a third, the arrangement becoming permanent without any formal declaration. It simply was. She was part of the ranch now, a fixed point in its daily rotation. But her value, as she had promised, extended far beyond the kitchen. One evening, after the meal was cleared and Leo was asleep on a small pallet she'd made for him by the hearth, Cora sat at the kitchen table with the ranch's ledgers. They were a disaster. Years of hasty entries, smudged calculations, and missing receipts. To Silas, they were a necessary evil, a source of constant frustration. To Cora, who had meticulously managed the accounts of her bustling tea house, they were a story waiting to be read. She worked late into the nights, fueled by weak tea and a relentless need for order. She cross-referenced bills of lading with paid invoices, her pen scratching softly in the lamplight. A pattern began to emerge, a subtle but persistent discrepancy that pricked at her attention. It was centered around their primary supplier in Casper, a man named Henderson, who provided their bulk grain, salt, and other necessities. Henderson was a friend of Marcus Thorne, the neighboring rancher who had been trying to buy Silas out for years. Silas disliked Thorne, but considered Henderson a necessary part of business. The invoices seemed correct at a glance. The prices were high, but everything was expensive when hauled this far out. But Cora noticed something else: the weights. The invoices listed weights in neat, round numbers: 500 pounds of oats, 100 pounds of salt. But the delivery slips, which the freighters had the hands sign, sometimes had different, messier numbers scribbled on them, often slightly less. Furthermore, the prices for certain items fluctuated wildly, always peaking during the months when the ranch's need was most desperate, like before winter or during calving season. It was a classic swindle, elegant in its simplicity. A slow, steady bleed. A few pounds shaved off each delivery, a few cents added to each pound. Over a single transaction, it was negligible. Over 5 years, Cora calculated, it was a staggering sum. It was the cost of a new bull, a new roof for the barn, 2 good horses. It was the difference between struggling and breaking even. She did not immediately go to Silas with her suspicions. An accusation without proof was just gossip, so she set a quiet trap. The next time the freighter was due from Henderson's supply house, she was ready. She had Finn help her rig a balance scale in the barn, using a heavy beam and carefully measured sacks of stone as counterweights. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. When the freighter arrived, a burly man with a disinterested expression, Cora met him at the wagon. "Mr. Blackwood wants everything weighed before we unload," she said pleasantly, handing him a cup of hot coffee. "New policy. For the books." The man grumbled but complied. As Finn and Gus helped unload the sacks of grain, Cora weighed each one. The sack of oats marked 100 pounds on the invoice weighed 92. The sack of cornmeal weighed 89. The pattern was consistent across the entire shipment. They were being shorted by nearly 10%. That night, she laid it all out for Silas on the kitchen table. The old ledgers, the new invoices, and her own neatly written sheet detailing the day's weigh-in. The lamplight cast deep shadows on his face as he stared at the papers, his jaw tight. "I checked the arithmetic on your old invoices," Cora said quietly. "He also overcharged you on the calculations. Not by much each time. $1 here, 50 cents there. But it adds up." She pushed a final sheet of paper toward him. On it was a single stark number. The total amount she calculated the ranch had been overcharged in the past 5 years. Silas looked at the number, and a low, guttural sound escaped his throat. It was the sound of a man seeing the face of a thief he had mistaken for a partner. He looked up from the papers, not at them, but at Cora. Her expression was not triumphant. It was sober, factual. She had discovered a sickness in his ranch, and she was presenting the diagnosis. "Thorne's man," Silas said, his voice rough. "All this time, bleeding me dry, and I never saw it." He stood up and paced the length of the kitchen, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He was a man of action, and his first instinct was rage, a desire to ride to Casper and confront Henderson physically. But then he stopped and looked back at the table, at the calm, ordered evidence Cora had assembled. That was not her way, and it was her way that had uncovered this. He sat back down, the anger in him slowly giving way to a cold, clear purpose. "What do you suggest?" he asked. The question was a profound admission. He was no longer just the owner, and she the cook. He was asking for her counsel. He was treating her as a partner. "A confrontation will only get you a denial," Cora said, "and Henderson will simply be more careful in the future. Legal action would be your word against his, and Marcus Thorne has deep pockets. No, the smart play is to change the game." She explained her plan. It was simple, strategic, and leveraged the one thing Henderson and Thorne wouldn't be expecting: intelligence. The next time Silas went to town, he was to visit the other ranchers, the smaller operators, who also bought from Henderson. He was not to accuse, but to ask questions. To suggest they start weighing their own deliveries, just for the sake of good bookkeeping, he was to do the same with the territorial freight master, raising a casual concern about inconsistent weights. He would sow the seeds of doubt not as an accuser, but as a concerned peer. Then he was to send a letter to a different supplier in Cheyenne, a larger, more reputable firm, asking for a quote based on bulk purchasing for a consortium of local ranchers. Silas listened, his expression shifting from anger to a grudging admiration. Cora wasn't proposing a war, she was proposing a coup. By uniting the other ranchers, he would break Henderson's local monopoly. By exposing the cheating subtly, he would ruin Henderson's reputation without firing a shot. The power would shift back to the buyers. He acted on her plan the following week. The results were precisely as she had predicted. Whispers started among the other ranchers. Henderson's next deliveries were met with scales and suspicious eyes. Within a month, his business had dried up, and the new firm from Cheyenne was delivering honest weight for an honest price to half the ranches in the county. One evening, a few weeks later, Silas found Cora by the creek, watching Leo skip stones across the water's surface. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep violet. "Your plan worked," Silas said, stopping beside her. "Henderson's packing up. Sold his business for pennies on the dollar." "Honesty is better for business in the long run," Cora said, her gaze on her son. Silas was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the plink of stones on water and the sigh of the wind through the cottonwoods. "I've been running this place on my own for so long," he said, his voice lower than usual, stripped of its hard edges. "Since my wife passed. I thought being strong meant doing it all myself, never asking for help. I was wrong." He looked at her, his creekstone eyes holding a new light. "You've done more for this ranch in 2 months than I've managed in 2 years. You saved us more money than I pay you in a year." He paused. "Thank you, Cora." It was the first time he had used her given name. It hung in the air between them, a small but significant thing. "We are all just trying to hold on to what is ours, Mr. Blackwood," she replied softly. "Silas," he corrected her gently. "My name is Silas." She finally turned to look at him, a genuine small smile touching her lips. "Silas," she repeated. A new level of trust had been forged between them, not over a meal or a mended fence, but over a shared victory of intellect and integrity. In the fading light, the ranch behind them seemed to stand a little straighter, its foundations suddenly feeling deeper and more secure. The victory over Henderson brought a period of quiet prosperity to the Blackwood Ranch. With the financial bleeding stopped, Silas was able to invest back into the property. New fencing went up, taut and strong. The barn roof was patched, and the shutter on the main house was finally rehung. The entire place seemed to exhale, shedding the weary, down-at-heel look it had worn for so long. The atmosphere among the men lifted as well. Jed, humbled and perhaps a little shamed, became less sullen. He still kept his distance from Cora, but the open hostility was gone, replaced by a grudging, silent respect. He did his work, ate his meals, and never again questioned her authority in the kitchen. But in the high country, peace was often just the quiet eye of an approaching storm. The true threat had not been a cheating supplier. Henderson had only been a symptom. The disease was Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a man of corrosive ambition, who saw the world as a collection of things to be owned. He viewed Silas's struggling ranch not with sympathy, but with predatory hunger. He had coveted the Blackwood land for years, not just for its grazing, but for its access to the deep, reliable current of the Sweetwater Creek, which ran right through Silas's property. Thorne had been patient. He had assumed Silas's grief and weariness would eventually force him to sell for a pittance. He had encouraged Henderson's swindling to hasten that day. But now, things were changing. The Blackwood Ranch was recovering. It was growing stronger. Thorne's patience ran out. The attack, when it came, was not with rifles, but with paper. It was a blistering hot afternoon in late August when the sheriff from Casper rode in, a prissy, self-important man named Davies, who was widely known to be in Thorne's pocket. He was accompanied by a lawyer from Cheyenne, a man with a thin mustache and eyes that never seemed to blink. They dismounted, their town clothes looking absurdly out of place against the dust and manure of the ranch yard. Silas met them on the porch, his face a grim mask. Cora watched from the kitchen window, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Leo, sensing the tension, came to stand beside her, his small hand finding hers. The lawyer, with a theatrical flourish, unrolled a sheaf of documents. "Silas Blackwood," he announced, his voice slick and condescending. "I have here a legal injunction, filed in the territorial court and effective immediately. It concerns the water rights to the Sweetwater Creek." Silas's blood ran cold. "My family's had those rights for 50 years. The deed is as solid as that mountain. Ah, but a recent survey commissioned by my client, Mr. Marcus Thorne, has uncovered a prior claim," the lawyer said with a smug smile. "A claim dating back to the original territorial land grants of 1868. It seems the survey that established your property line was in error. The creek, and a 50-yard easement on either side, has belonged to the parcel of land now owned by Mr. Thorne all along. It was a lie. A brazen, audacious lie. But it was a lie wrapped in the authority of the law. The injunction, stamped and signed, forbade Silas from watering his cattle at the creek until the matter could be settled in court, a process that could take months, even years. "You can't do this," Silas growled, his hands clenching into fists. "My herd will die in a week without that water." "That is unfortunate," the lawyer said, his expression anything but. "Mr. Thorne, however, in a spirit of neighborly generosity, is prepared to renew his offer to purchase your land. Given these new circumstances, the price will of course have to be adjusted downward, but it would solve your immediate problem." It was checkmate. Thorne was holding a gun to the ranch's head and calling it a business negotiation. The sheriff, Davies, puffed out his chest. "The law is the law, Silas. I'll be posting men along the creek to ensure the injunction is obeyed. Don't make any trouble." Rage, black and absolute, consumed Silas. It was the impotent fury of a man trapped in a cage built of lies. He wanted to smash the lawyer's smug face, to tear the papers from his hand and set them on fire. But he knew it would be useless. Thorn had him. He was cornered, legally and logistically. The only other water source for miles was a small spring that would be dry in 2 days trying to water a herd this size. After the men rode out, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of their false authority behind, a terrible silence fell over the ranch. The hands stood in a stunned, helpless group. Silas stormed into the house, the screen door slamming behind him with the force of a thunderclap. Cora heard the clink of a bottle against a glass, followed by a heavy, despairing silence. He was trapped. The rancher, the man of the land, the master of his domain, was rendered powerless by a piece of paper. His strength, his experience, his physical presence, none of it mattered against the twisted logic of a corrupt legal system. He retreated into a fortress of whiskey and fury, the weight of imminent failure pressing down on him, crushing the fight out of him. The ranch was adrift, its captain locked in his cabin while the ship sailed straight for the rocks. Cora stood at the window, watching the sun beat down on the parched land. She could already see the cattle gathering near the forbidden creek, their lowing full of confusion and thirst. She looked toward the main room, where Silas sat in a self-imposed prison of despair. She knew that if anything was to be done, it would not be done by him. Not this time. This was not a problem that could be solved with anger or strength. This was a problem that required a different kind of weapon altogether. It required a mind that could see the shape of a lie and find the one thread that, if pulled, would unravel the entire fabrication. That evening, the ranch was a place of ghosts. The usual sounds of men talking and laughing after a day's work were absent. They ate Cora's food mechanically, their faces grim. Silas did not come to the table at all. The bottle on the table beside his chair in the main room was half empty. His formidable presence had collapsed into a dark, brooding silence that filled the entire house with a sense of dread. He was beaten. Cora moved through the quiet chaos with a preternatural calm. She served the men, cleared the plates, and put Leo to bed, humming his lullaby softly, a small anchor of normalcy in a world that had come unmoored. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind was racing, sifting through details, searching for a crack in Thorn's perfect lie. A prior claim from 1868, a faulty survey. These were the pillars of the injunction. They sounded solid, official. But Cora, who had built a business on contracts and receipts, knew that paper could lie as easily as a man. The strength of a document was not in its seal, but in its truthfulness. After the house was quiet, she lit a single lamp and went not to the ledgers, but to a place no one had disturbed in years. A large, dusty steamer trunk in the attic, filled with old family papers. Silas's father's papers, his grandfather's. She had stumbled upon it weeks ago while searching for spare linens. The air in the attic was thick and still, smelling of old paper and dried herbs. With Finn holding the lamp, his young face pale with worry, Cora carefully lifted the heavy lid. Inside was a lifetime of history, old letters, tintypes of severe-looking ancestors, and, at the very bottom, a bundle of oilcloth-wrapped documents. She carried them down to the kitchen table. With gentle fingers, she untied the brittle string and unrolled the contents. They were the original deeds and survey maps for the Blackwood property. The paper yellowed and fragile. The map, drawn in spidery ink, was dated 1874. It clearly showed the Sweetwater Creek running through the heart of the property. But Thorn's claim was based on an earlier grant from 1868. This map, on its own, was not enough. But there was something else in the bundle. A smaller, hand-drawn map, almost a sketch, tucked inside a folded letter. The letter was from Silas's grandfather to his brother, describing the land. The government survey has marked our northwest corner with an iron stake by the old lightning-struck oak, he had written. From there, the line runs straight to the granite outcrop on the ridge. The creek is ours, clear and true. Cora's breath caught. A physical marker. An iron stake by a lightning-struck oak. Thorn's new survey would have established new markers, but what if the original still existed? She looked at Gus, the old sage, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, watching her. "Gus," she said, her voice sharp with purpose. "A lightning-struck oak on the northwest border. Do you know of it?" Gus was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant, searching through the landscape of his memory. He had worked this ranch for 40 years. He knew its bones. There was one, he said slowly, his voice raspy. Big old cottonwood. Got split down the middle in a storm when I was just a boy. Most of it's gone now. Just a stump, maybe. Thorne's land borders ours up there. He put up a new fence last year. That was it. The thread. We're going to find it, Cora announced. She was no longer a cook, no longer a housekeeper. She was a commander, preparing for battle. She turned to Finn. Saddle 3 horses. Bring 2 shovels and a crowbar. Finn, galvanized by her certainty, scrambled to obey. Gus pushed himself to his feet, a new light in his old eyes. As they were about to leave, Silas appeared in the doorway, his face shadowed, his eyes bleary with whiskey and despair. "What are you doing?" he slurred. "It's over, Cora. He's won." Cora walked right up to him, her expression fierce. "No," she said, her voice low and intense. "It is not over. He has told a lie on paper, and we are going to unearth the truth from the dirt. You can sit here and drown yourself in pity, or you can get on a horse and help me save your home, but we are going, with or without you." She pushed past him and walked out into the moonlit yard. For a long moment, Silas stood there, stunned, the fog of his despair pierced by the sheer force of her will. He looked at the half-empty bottle, then at the determined figures of Cora, Gus, and Finn, mounting their horses. He saw the truth of her words. While he had surrendered, she had declared war. A flicker of his old self, the fighter, the man who had built this ranch, sparked to life. With a curse, he kicked the door jamb and strode toward the corral. They rode under the cold light of a full moon, a strange posse armed not with guns, but with shovels and a 50-year-old map. Gus led the way, his memory guiding them across the dark, silent pastures toward the northwest boundary. The air was tense, filled with a desperate, fragile hope. They found the new fence Thorne had built, a sharp, aggressive line of fresh posts and taut wire. And just beyond it, on what was now claimed as Thorne's land, was the gnarled, blackened stump Gus had described. "This is the place," Gus said, his voice certain. They dismounted and tied the horses. Silas, now sober and grimly focused, took one of the shovels. They started to dig around the base of the stump, the shovels biting into the dry, compacted earth. The work was hard, the ground stubborn. For an hour, the only sound was the scrape of metal on dirt and rock, and the ragged sound of their breathing. Doubt began to creep in. "Maybe it's gone," Finn said, leaning on his shovel, sweat pouring down his face. "Keep digging," Cora commanded, her eyes scanning the ground, searching for any sign. It was Silas who found it. His shovel struck something with a solid, metallic thud that was different from the sound of hitting rock. "Here," he said, his voice tight. They fell to their knees, digging with their bare hands like treasure hunters. They scraped away the dirt, and there it was, a thick, rust-eaten piece of iron, driven deep into the earth. It was the original survey stake from 1874, exactly where Silas's grandfather had said it would be. And it was a full 100 yards inside Thorne's new fence line. The fence was a lie. The survey was a lie. The entire claim was a fraud. They stood there, looking at the simple, irrefutable piece of iron, and in that moment, the power shifted. Thorne's intricate legal trap had been sprung, not by a lawyer, but by a woman's refusal to surrender, an old man's memory, and a truth buried in the dirt. They did not ride to confront Thorne. That would have been his game, a game of bluster and violence. Cora had a better plan. They rode back to the ranch in the pre-dawn light, carrying not just the truth, but the evidence. Cora sat at the kitchen table, her face smudged with dirt, and began to write. She did not write to Thorne or to the corrupt Sheriff Davies. She wrote a letter to Judge Wallace, the senior territorial judge in Cheyenne, a man known to be fiercely independent and devoted to the letter of the law. In clear, concise prose, she laid out the entire situation. Thorne's long-standing desire for the land, the suspicious timing of the survey, the injunction that threatened the ranch's existence. She then described their discovery, the letter from Silas's grandfather, the hand-drawn map, and the unearthing of the original 1874 survey marker. She included a sworn, witnessed affidavit from Gus, attesting to the location of the lightning-struck tree. She made a careful tracing of the old map and a sketch of the location of the discovered stake relative to Thorne's new fence. It was a masterful piece of legal correspondence, written by a tea house owner with a head for logic. It didn't just make an accusation. It presented a chain of irrefutable evidence. It painted Marcus Thorne not as a clever businessman, but as a common fraud. When she was done, she handed the packet of documents to Silas. "Send your fastest rider," she said. "Not to Casper. Straight to Cheyenne, to the judge's personal clerk." Silas took the papers, his hand trembling slightly as he felt their weight. He looked at Cora, at the intelligence and unyielding strength in her eyes, and he felt a wave of awe that eclipsed even his relief. He had been ready to lose everything. He had been drowning, and she had built him a raft out of old paper and buried iron. The defeat of Marcus Thorne was not loud, but it was absolute. Judge Wallace, enraged by the blatant attempt to manipulate his court, acted with swift and brutal efficiency. He not only quashed the injunction but launched a full investigation into Thorne and Sheriff Davies for conspiracy and fraud. Thorne's power, built on intimidation and corrupt alliances, crumbled. He became a pariah in the very community he had sought to dominate. Men who had feared him now openly scorned him. His reputation was ruined more completely than if he had lost a gunfight. He was defeated morally, socially, and legally. The threat was over. A week later, a profound quiet settled over the Blackwood ranch. It was not the tense silence of impending doom, but the deep, peaceful quiet of security. The cattle drank freely from the Sweetwater Creek. The men worked with a lighter step. The future, which had been a terrifying void, was once again a place of possibility. One evening, Cora was in her usual place, standing at the kitchen counter, kneading dough for the morning's bread. The motion was familiar, comforting, a rhythm that had seen her through the worst of times. The house was quiet. Leo was asleep on his pallet, and the men were in the bunkhouse. Silas came into the kitchen. He didn't speak for a long time, simply stood in the doorway, watching her hands work the dough. The lamp cast a warm golden light on the room, on the clean surfaces, on the calm, methodical movements of the woman who had become the ranch's center of gravity. Finally, he moved to the table and sat down. He laid a folded legal document on the scrubbed wood surface. "The world is a funny place," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual gruffness. "A man spends his whole life learning how to fight with his fists and a rope and a branding iron. He thinks that's strength. He thinks that's what it takes to hold on to a place like this." Cora did not stop her work, but she was listening, her whole being attuned to his words. "I was ready to give up," he continued, looking at his own large, calloused hands on the table. "I was beat, and you fought back. Not with a gun, with a ledger, with a 50-year-old letter and a shovel. You saved this place, Cora." He looked up at her, and his eyes, those gray creekstone eyes, were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen there before. This ranch needed a foreman. It needed a fighter. It needed a miracle. He shook his head slowly. What it got was something better. It got a heart. He pushed the document across the table toward her. "I had the lawyer in Cheyenne draw this up, the one who works for the judge, not the other kind." Cora wiped her floured hands on her apron and picked up the paper. She unfolded it. It was not a paycheck. It was not a contract for employment. It was a deed of partnership. It gave her a 40% stake in the Blackwood Ranch, in the land, the herd, the brand, in everything. She read the dense legal text, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. It was all there, inarguable and binding. A home, a future, security, everything she had lost. "This is your home now, Cora," Silas said softly. "If you'll have it. Your name on the deed, same as mine. A partner. Not a cook, not a housekeeper. A partner." He hesitated, then added, his voice even quieter, "And a home for the boy. A place for him to grow up safe." Cora looked from the paper to Silas's earnest, waiting face. She thought of the ash and ruin of her tea house, of the long, desperate walk to this ranch, of the fear that had been her constant companion. She looked around the warm, clean kitchen, at the sleeping form of her son by the fire. This place was in her bones now. She had scoured its floors, balanced its books, defended its borders. She had made it her own, through the sheer force of her competence and will. She did not need to cry. She did not need to make a grand speech. She folded the deed carefully and placed it on the counter beside her dough. She looked at Silas, a deep and abiding calm settling over her. "We'll have it," she said. The words were simple, but they were a vow. It was not the acceptance of a desperate refugee. It was the choice of a queen to remain in the kingdom she had helped to save. A slow smile spread across Silas's face, erasing the lines of weariness and leaving something younger in their place. He nodded, a world of understanding passing between them in that simple gesture. He was no longer the weathered, cynical owner, and she was no longer the capable outsider. They were partners. First snow of the season came early that year, a thick, silent blanket that covered the high country and insulated the ranch from the rest of the world. It was a Tuesday evening, months after the deed was signed. A fire crackled in the hearth of the main room, its light dancing on the walls. The wind howled outside, but inside there was only a profound and gentle peace. Silas sat in his worn armchair, not with a bottle, but with the copy of Ivanhoe. He was reading aloud, his deep voice stumbling occasionally over the flowery language, but his tone full of gentle gravity. Across from him, Finn listened, his face rapt with attention, his lips silently forming the words as Silas spoke them. Gus sat near the fire, mending a bridle, a rare, contented smile on his face. In the kitchen, Cora was not cooking. She was sitting at the table with a cup of tea, a sketch pad open in front of her. On the paper was a drawing, a plan. It was for a small building, a new addition to be built come spring, with a wide porch and large windows facing the morning sun. It looked a bit like a small house, but the notes in the margin spoke of tables, of porcelain cups, of blends of tea made from local herbs and imported leaves. Leo was on the floor by the fire, no longer a silent, still statue. He was carefully building a miniature version of the ranch out of wooden blocks. There was the main house, the barn, the corrals. He placed a small carved figure of a man by the house, then a woman, then a small boy. He looked up at Silas. "Will the knight save the lady?" Leo asked, his voice clear and curious. It was the longest sentence he had ever spoken to the man. Silas stopped reading and looked down at the boy, a look of pure, unadulterated wonder on his face. He smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "I think," he said, looking over at Cora, who was watching them, her own smile soft and luminous, "that sometimes the lady saves herself, and the knight is just lucky enough to be there to see it." Cora's gaze drifted from the warm scene in the house to her drawing on the table. They had burned her tea house to the ground, the place that had been her whole world. They had taken her home of porcelain and promises. But as she looked at the faces in the firelight, at the man who had become her partner, and the child who was finally finding his voice, she knew she had not been left with nothing. The world had taken one dream, but it had given her something far more durable in its place. It had given her a home made of iron and dirt, of resilience and respect. The cowboy hadn't just offered her a job. He had, with her help, built her a new life, and was now ready to help her build a new dream, right here, in the heart of it all.